Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you, and I hope you had a lovely weekend. And welcome to our Bible talk for today. What a lovely, beautiful Monday morning it is. Makes you glad to be around, and good to see you today. And thank you. We are, as you know, working our way through the Gospel of Matthew. We're now in chapter 21 of 28. Just to kind of set the context so you know what's going on, because actually in this particular reading it's very important, especially important. It's always important, but it's very important this morning. Jesus has entered Jerusalem. Okay, we did Palm Sunday on Friday, you might say. Jesus coming to Jerusalem, he's cleansed the temple, and then he's gone away. Then he goes overnight to Bethany, and he basically he's living in Bethany, and he's commuting. Essentially, he's like commuting into Jerusalem every day. It's about a 2-mile walk. It's not far. So without further ado, Matthew chapter 21, starting to read at verse 17. Jesus left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. In the morning, when he returned to the city, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the side of the road, he went to it and found nothing on it but leaves. Then he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" Jesus answered them, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what's been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' it will be done. Whatever you ask for, in prayer and faith, you will receive." When he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it from human origin?" And they argued with one another. If we say, "From heaven," he will say, "Why then did you not believe him?" And if we say, "Of human origin," we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know." He said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." He answered, "I will not." But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said the same, and he answered, "I go, sir," but he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? And they said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Right. Many a sermon in this. I'm scratched the surface. I'm aware there's lots I'm going to miss out, but I'll give it my best shot this morning. There are, I think, basically 3 sections, if you like, in this. First is the incident with the fig tree. Then there's the question about the authority of John the Baptist. And finally, there's this business about the parable of the 2 sons. And there's bits in between, but they're the ones I want to pick on this morning. I want to do the first one, the third one, and then the second one. You'll see why in a minute. Firstly, Jesus' business with the fig tree. Basically, Jesus he goes his 2-mile walk into Jerusalem, and he gets there and he's hungry. He sees a fig tree, wants something to eat. He's hoping for a nice juicy fig to keep him going for the day. Finds nothing on the fig tree except leaves. So he says, "May nothing come of you again." He curses it, and it shrivels up there and then. A bit like I do with gardening, just most of the plants in my garden, but just process sped up a bit. Seems like it. So what's going on here? I mean, on the face of it, it sounds like Jesus just has a bit of a strop on, doesn't he? Fig tree, okay, But I'm sure Jesus didn't do that. Of course he didn't. And I'm not sure we're necessarily standing up for the rights of fig trees here. I think that misses the point, rather. So what's going on here? Why does Jesus curse this unfruitful fig tree? Well, I think what's interesting is this. I think you've got to remember what has recently happened. Jesus, in the same chapter, and only the previous day, has been into the temple. And he's clearly got very angry in the temple and overturned the money changes and that sort of stuff. He's clearly had quite a scene in the temple. Now, fig trees are code for fruitfulness. When the fig tree having a blossom, that's considered to be good times. And a fig tree not is bad times, barren times. And a fig tree is there basically to make figs so that people can eat. And Jesus is hungry, and this fig tree is not doing its job, which is why Jesus curses it. And I think, in a sense, what you've got to do is make a link with the temple the previous day. I think it's interesting that Matthew's put the two incidents quite right up against each other. Because I think what Jesus is saying here is something pretty devastating about the religious leaders and about the temple. The temple is there for people to meet God. The temple was supposed to be a place where people could meet God and encounter God from all nations. That everybody, whatever situation you were in, if you wanted God, you could go in there and you could meet God in there. And for people who are hungry for God, the temple just wasn't doing its business. And I think what he's doing here is by cursing his fig tree, is illustrating the fact that hungry people need something to eat. And actually, spiritually, people that need God need to be able to approach God. And what the temple people were doing is they just weren't doing it right, and they weren't bearing fruit. They weren't doing their job. People were supposed to be able to meet God in there, but by filling the place with the market and being away from God, so to speak, they were preventing people from meeting God. So he curses the fig tree to illustrate the point that it wasn't doing its job, so it needs to be replaced. And likewise, the temple wasn't doing its job, so it needs to be replaced too. That's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is another devastating comment on the leaders at the time, was this business about the two sons. And he draws the illustration of two sons, both of whom were asked to go and help in the vineyard or whatever, wherever it was, the farm or whatever. And the first one says, "I won't," but then does it. And the second one says, "I will," but then doesn't. And the one that says he won't, but actually does the goods, is the one that's right with God. I guess it's a spiritual way of saying the proof of the pudding's in the eating, isn't it, really? And here he's making a fairly devastating comparison between the religious leaders at the time and the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the well-known sinners, if you like. That the religious leaders said all the right things but didn't do it right, whereas the prostitutes and tax collectors here, the lowlifes, if you like, are considered to be at the time, they were people who, in a sense, they hadn't done it, hadn't said they were going to do, but actually were coming good for God. And Jesus here is making a pretty interesting comparison between the religious leaders at the time and what you might call sinners and prostitutes and that sort of stuff at the time. And he's making a pretty devastating comment about the religious leaders at the time. And it's about, I guess this is about being right with God, about doing the Christian faith, not just talking about it. It's about not just having the right words, but actually having the right deeds and doing it right with God. And actually not just talking about it, but actually going through with the goods. And I guess there's a responsibility on us today to make sure that we do the same, that we don't just say fine words about God, but actually we live out the Christian gospel in the community. We don't just talk about it and make fancy words and fancy promises, but we actually go through with it. So that's the lesson to us. But again, Jesus is making a pretty devastating comparison here between the religious leaders with their fancy words and the prostitutes and tax collectors who actually came through for God in Jesus. That's the second thing. The third thing is this question, which they come and ask Jesus, and they ask him, by what authority are you doing these things? They're clearly talking about the fact that what happened in the temple the previous day. Who do you think you are? And this, by what authority? And whatever you may think, that this wasn't a friendly question, that they were asking questions of him. And Jesus knew straight away they were trying to trip him up. They tried many, many clever methods and clever questions to try and trip him up in the hope that he'd say something, and then they could accuse him and they could get rid of him. That's what they planned to do. And Jesus, of course, saw straight through this. So Jesus responds to their question with a question, which they can't answer. And the authority of John, is it from man or from God? And in a sense, he puts them in a position where they can't answer either, because if they say it's from God, they'll say, "Why didn't you listen?" If they say it's from man, they're frightened of the crowd. And Jesus knows that. What I think is interesting, though, is that they question Jesus, but in the end, Jesus ends up questioning them. And I think there's something really profound in that. I think we tend to think that what's important is what we think about Jesus. But we think that what people think about Jesus is really important. And it's not unimportant. Of course it isn't. What I think is interesting here is that they start by questioning Jesus, but in the end, Jesus questions them. And I don't know about you, but I listen, especially in Gospels like Matthew, really. I think what Jesus says and what Jesus does asks a lot of questions about me. I think it asks questions about the way I live my life. I think it asks me questions about my priorities and about my commitments and what I would and wouldn't do. I think it asks questions about all sorts of things in my life. And I tend to think about it, what I think about the Gospels, or what I think about Jesus. But actually, I think in the end, I've listened to these words, and especially the cross, which we're about to encounter in the next few days in here, and of course in a few days' time at church and so on. I think as much as I ask questions of Jesus, and people ask questions of Jesus, I think Jesus asks questions of us too. And I guess I want us to hear that this morning. So, three things in this morning's reading. Firstly, the parable of the fig tree. Okay, it's Jesus is saying, it'd be about being fruitful, and the importance. And he's saying about the temple, it needs to be replaced because it wasn't bearing fruit for God. People who are hungry for God weren't able to get there, and so like the fig tree, they need to be replaced. And of course, he becomes the new temple. Second is this story about the two sons, and it's about that tells us the importance of actually doing with God, not just having fine words. And thirdly, reading these passages and allowing Jesus to ask questions of us, and I think that's quite important. So in the next few days, have your ears and your hearts and your minds open to what Jesus might be asking of you, and Jesus might be asking of me. Hope that makes